This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Mirus. I'm here with my co-host, Nathan Douglas. Hello, Nathan.
Hello, Thomas.
And we are back here with our final episode in our 4-part series on church teaching on cinema. In our previous 3 episodes, we went through encyclicals and apostolic exhortations by Pius XI and Pius XII. And now we're talking about a range of documents, really in the period starting with Vatican II and beyond, going up to the time, 1995, the time of the Vatican film list. These are documents that are either by Paul VI and John Paul II or came out under their pontificates from various, pontifical councils and whatnot, as well as a document from Vatican II itself, of course, dealing with cinema in various ways or mass media, including cinema. And it's, I didn't even really know that when we started thinking about doing this series, that we would do an episode after the Pius XII, because I didn't really think there was much to speak of church documents on cinema between Pius XII and the Vatican film list, which of course we already discussed on the podcast. So what we're doing today is getting kind of an overall picture of a period of church engagement with the art form. And it's not so much about any one document. A lot of these documents deal with a lot of things besides cinema. And so rather than sort of doing a deep dive on any one document, we are mostly sort of pulling quotes that we find interesting.
I like to look at this period of history from a filmmaker's perspective and a particular kind of narrative framing question, which is, okay, so we have, this very kind of obvious engagement with cinema as an art form, as a social phenomenon, from the 1930s into the 1950s. We have this developing understanding from the magisterium of film as an art form and what that can mean. And then things kind of get quiet on that front, at least with regards to film specifically itself as an art form. From the 60s onwards, everything is about media, social communications. It's this big blanket term. What's really interesting is when you talk with a lot of people about films and, films by Catholics, everyone has this concept of the kind of Catholic film they don't want to see. And it tends to be something they see as overly pious and low budget. And it's just not, meeting the standard artistically or narratively or even spiritually. That, as a filmmaker who's looking at the history of this, the question is, how did we get to this point? We have all this church engagement with film, and in the 1950s, they're courting world-class filmmakers like Roberto Rossellini. The church is very involved with the development of neorealism in the late 1940s and the 1950s. They're really kind of, on the ground with a lot of things happening in world-class cinema. And then somehow that just went away. Somehow we ended up in this situation where, again, looking at like world cinema as a whole, it's just not the same. And so that's partly in the background of when I look at these documents is what shifted, what changed, what might have happened in the history of the church's engagement that may have affected the way that Catholics were making films, the way that Catholics were engaging with film culture. How did we get from this very specific focus on, yes, film, we get this, and here's how we're going to address it, to, basically a Catholic film culture, again, a culture of cinema within the church that is extremely, almost non-existent, I would say. It's not what you would expect when you read the ideal film and you think, okay, how did that go?
Do you think that social communications could be like the 1960s version of like the term content or something like that?
I think that's a big part of it. I think social communications is a term that is very easily, obviously it's extremely broad, and we'll get into this. There are very good things about the term social communications, and I have to say very, very providential things about the way that, the way that God has allowed all this to play out. But one of the possible downsides of that is, yes, social communications is so broad, and it's encompassing, along with media, that it's almost useless at the level of individual arts. For the filmmaker, and I guess you could say this for any of the practitioners of these arts, but I think the filmmaker is the one that's particularly kind of left out in the cold by this development.
Yeah.
Because there are principles that apply to news media that transfer very easily to particular applications of, someone who's producing television shows, especially documentaries or news shows,
right.
Radio as well. Expression, communication really is kind of the goal. Like, film is capable of more. It's capable of a genuinely poetic experience, something
Right.
that is in the what's not said. It's in the in between.
And it's not that these documents are denying that. I mean, they do reference that, but necessarily that tends to be a bit of like a side note to the overall theme of communication, and particularly under the aspect of like mass media forms.
Absolutely. And I think just to kind of put this in context with what was happening before, in the particularly in the magisterium of Pius XII, what we're seeing there is really the flowering of this idea that film is a fine art. In the French context, the French have for a long time, they've called film the seventh art, like it's the seventh fine art on top of, the six. I'm always going to get this mixed up, but, theater, dance, painting, music, sculpture, literature, the arts that we would think of as primordial in a sense. There is no historical invention date for the fine arts. They've just always been with us in some sense. Whereas obviously cinema and other forms of new media, historically, we know there was a period in time when it didn't exist, and then boom, 1895, cinema exists. The movement of the first 50 years of film history was partly a movement towards realizing that film can be certainly it's affects us in the way that the fine arts at their best affect us. And so we start to treat it like a fine art. We start to theorize it like a fine art, which would mean, especially from a Catholic point of view, really theorizing it from the lens of the transcendentals, of the truth, goodness, and beauty, the way that we would approach the fine arts. During the council and afterwards, we see this shift to treating film as more of a new way of communicating. The greatest thing about this particular way of approaching it is that the church is really getting to the widest possible existential kind of framework for why this matters and for what it is. Everything, in the context, in a theological context, I should say, it's not so much as much a philosophical kind of approach. It's really looking at the theological meaning of technology, which is incredibly compelling. The challenge of that is, especially from our vantage point, the meaning of what communication has not fundamentally changed, but socially it has changed. Colloquially, it has changed. And the way that we use those terms in the church, the way that that's developed in the media that Catholics are making has changed. It reflects a view that is not, in my opinion, as rich, as poetic, certainly, as, what it originally could mean.
But let's go into what is in some way the founding document of this era, from Vatican II, Inter Mirifica from 1963, which, as you said, is the proclamation on what's the sort of subtitle for this?
The Decree on the Media of Social Communications.
So we'll look at a few quotes here, one of which is this question of the relationship between, quote, the rights, as they are called, of art and the norms of morality. Since the mounting controversies in this area frequently take their rise from false teachings about ethics and aesthetics, the Council proclaims that all must hold to the absolute primacy of the objective moral order. That is, this order by itself surpasses and fittingly coordinates all other spheres of human affairs, the arts not excepted, even though they be endowed with notable dignity. So, I mean, that's an important point there. And we talked about this in Pius XI, where he assigns a moral end to art, and then Pius XII qualifies that. But basically, even if the proximate end of the fine arts is not necessarily moral goodness, it still exists within this moral sphere, man being an inherently moral creature. And so, yeah, that's an important point, especially when, at the time of Vatican II, we're getting even more kind of all sorts of different radical, artistic movements going on in all medium, including film, theater, and so all kinds of experimentation, formal and psychological and moral and religious and everything else. And so just being grounded in that is good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's we see the consistency here, and this continues throughout all of the documents that we're going to look at, in a way that I think someone who's studying the aftermath of the council, especially the way that certain organizations associated with the church were responding, like a lot of things that happened after the council. There was a certain impression of what was going to happen or what was supposed to happen, and you go back to the documents, and this is continuing the church's thought on this topic.
It's repeatedly emphasized that government should make laws forbidding the use of media in a way that damages public morals, just as there had been in, the Piuses. This document says, just as earlier ones had, that viewers and listeners have obligations to favor good presentations and avoid those that would be a cause or occasion of spiritual harm to themselves or be a bad example to others, or that stuff is consistent. What you see less is the emphasis on the bishops need to be setting up review boards and making lists of films that Catholics can't see. It seems like that has already sort of gone away. Of course, with the USCCB had a film review board, until I don't know when that ended, a decade or two ago. But the emphasis in all these documents is much more about education and training for the viewers to be able to discern well according to Catholic principles, as well as just basic human values. And so it's less about making a list and more about that discernment according to general principles.
Common to the time, we if we compare this to other sort of relaxations like the treatment of Friday penance, there seems to be an optimism in the church figures who are talking during this time, where there's this expectation, this idea that man is capable of making prudent choices. He just kind of needs a bit more room to breathe, and then he'll choose the right things. And you definitely see that in how these documents talk about. Obviously, they talk about forming people to be able to make those choices, but there is a lot of optimism that people are already kind of there. They just need a little encouragement,
right?
Which I'm not sure that played out the way that they.
But setting aside the issue of relaxation of church law or optimism or anything like that, the stuff about formation and education is very important, because it's not just talking about like Catholic moral values. It's also talking about actually being able to be literate when it comes to symbols and images and how they're affecting you, to be able to be free, to be able to like resist propagandizing by different forms of media, and to know when you're being manipulated. And so there's all this stuff that's on like a human level and on an artistic level. The formation in those aspects are quite consequential, not just for your aesthetic judgments, but just for human dignity and for the ability of a population to have any kind of like moral freedom, because obviously if you give people their freedom and then they're just immediately the victims of like the press manipulation or something, then there's no real freedom to be had, which is obviously what we have now. An initial quote on this topic in this Vatican II document, it says, "Those who make use of the media of communications, especially the young, should take steps to accustom themselves to moderation and self-control in their regard. They should, moreover, endeavor to deepen their understanding of what they see, hear, or read. They should discuss these matters with their teachers and experts and learn to pass sound judgments on them." And this is one of the interesting things we have to discuss in this episode is this topic about media education and training and media literacy that is stressed in some of these documents. And I mean, there was some of that in Pius XII, I think, as well, if I remember correctly. But that's expanded on in terms of what that should look like in subsequent documents. So for the remainder of this conversation, rather than going document by document, I've kind of organized things, excerpts from them more topically. But just so people will know kind of what we're drawing from, Nathan, can you just give an overview of kind of the range of documents after Vatican II that we're drawing from here?
Yeah, from this point, what we're looking at is kind of the fruit of the Council and of Inter Mirifica, everything that it's laying down, documents that are fleshing out what it is saying. And especially in a practical sense, one of the immediate fruits that we see is the establishment of World Communications Day in the late 1960s, which continues to this day. That's a Sunday in May that's dedicated towards a communications theme, and the Pope usually writes a document every year explicating that theme.
So we're looking at a bunch of World Communications Day addresses by Pope St. Paul VI and Pope St. John Paul II. We're also looking at drawing from a document from 1971, Communio et Progressio, which was prepared under the command of this Inter Mirifica Vatican II document that we just discussed. And this document was put out by the Pontifical Council for Social Communications, which of course would later put out the Vatican Film List. There's also another document, Aetatis Novae, from 1992, put out 20 years after Communio et Progressio, also by the Pontifical Council for Social Communications. So the first theme I want to discuss is, across all of these documents, really has to do with the responsibility of artists, and not only in a negative sense of what they should avoid, but there's a number of sort of exhortations from Paul VI, from John Paul II, from the Pontifical Council of Social Communications, for them to really attain the heights of what they can attain, not just settle for sort of crass commercial lowest common denominator material. So I want to go through a few quotes on this topic, which sort of highlight different aspects of this. But the first being from the closing address of Vatican II in 1965, St. Paul VI to artists. He says, quote, "This world in which we live needs beauty in order not to sink into despair. It is beauty like truth which brings joy to the heart of man, and is that precious fruit which resists the wear and tear of time, which unites generations and makes them share things in admiration. And all of this is through your hands. May these hands be pure and disinterested. Remember that you are the guardians of beauty in the world. May that suffice to free you from tastes which are passing and have no genuine value, to free you from the search after strange or unbecoming expressions." That kind of covers two ends, right? It covers like the commercial entertainment, and it covers also kind of just like going crazy with experimentation, and especially you can see that in the Vatican II, or the post-Vatican II era, which unfortunately happened. A lot of strange and unbecoming expressions in religious art, church architecture, things like that, which he's warning against here.
Yeah, and I think it's striking to read this. He's very much operating in a poetic mode and talking about the transcendentals, it's very idealistic. In the documents that come after this, there is much more of a stronger focus on really the social aspect and the unity, the community, developing and fostering the community of man, and in such a way that the sort of the emphasis on truth, beauty, and goodness, like it's all there in content, but it's not sort of expressed in the same way, at least not until I would say not until you get to the pontificate of John Paul II, and especially the letter to artists. I feel like there's kind of this 30-year gap where, in talking about the arts, again, the church really focuses on the functional communicative aspect, the fundamental kind of aspect, and beauty kind of takes, kind of recedes somewhat during this time, but that's part of the interesting aspect of this arc that we're talking about, is that beauty will eventually reemerge as a primary value for the church's engagement with the arts.
Yeah, and there's this theme that was, I believe, in Pius XII also, that reminding artists that like you are a kind of cultural elite for a reason. You have a particular task to perform, and there's a kind of a noblesse oblige that you have in order to not just cater to the lowest common denominator and actually to lead the public in a certain way. And that's echoed in the first World Communications Day address in 1967 by Paul VI, where he says, we entertain the hope that the noble service which they are called upon to render to their brothers may always measure up to the nobility of the mission which makes them intermediaries and, as it were, masters and guides between the truth and the public, the reality of the exterior world and the inner reaches of conscience. Now, he's talking about social communicators in general, not just artists, but I think that that's important because there's just way too much of copping out and saying, well, I'm giving people what they want. If somebody may not say that in terms of morality, but they may say that in terms of the depths of their spiritual message, or they may say that about the sort of the artistic content. Even a lot of Catholic artists kind of take that approach. And so there's a fine line, I suppose you could say, between being accessible and dumbing down. But if you look at that from the perspective of the artist, it's really not a fine line at all. It's the difference between those two things is night and day in terms of the conscience and the consciousness of the artist. If you look at it in terms of, external results, sometimes there may be debatable points, but I think it's where the artist's heart is, that is not a fine line at all. It's a massive difference, and that ultimately does come through in what results.
Mm-hmm. And this is a tension that you see again, specifically with the film context. This is maybe just a little bit of history that ties into this. In the late 60s, in 68 and 69, the OCIC, the International Catholic Cinema Office, which is an organization that is was officially affiliated with the church, but wasn't like it was independently run, I guess. There was a scandal in the late 60s where what this organization would do is, since the 1950s, the late 40s, they would go to film festivals and they would give out prizes to a film that they thought was most reflective of like Catholic values or artistry. They give it to like the best. It's kind of this functional like best Catholic film in a sense is maybe a one way of thinking of it. But in 68, they gave the grand prize. They gave the OCIC prize to a film by Pier Paolo Pasolini, who we've talked about with his film The Gospel According to Matthew. He made a film called Theorema, which in English that would just be like theory or theorem. And it's a film with a lot of it's a very Marxist themed film. It's basically about the way that capitalism is attacking the family, played out in an artistic way. Very controversial scenes. There's a lot of scenes of a sexual nature in it. And anyway, this OCIC jury gave their prize to the film, which caused an uproar. You might think that was the end of it. The following year, another jury gave their prize at the Berlin Film Festival to Midnight Cowboy, which our listeners may be more familiar with just from like American film history as the first X-rated film to win Best Picture at the Oscars. Wow. First and only, we should say. And so that was another film that was extremely controversial, in the 60s and today as well, but it was, particularly controversial in the late 60s. And here was the OCIC jury awarded a grand prize to that as well. So on the heels of these two events, and the reason that they awarded these films was on artistic merit, and so what's interesting is in the defenses that were kind of given, they're really saying, we're looking at the artistry. We want to recognize these films are extremely well made, and that the moral question isn't the only criterion. Well, in these cases, and as the Pope himself, Pope Paul VI, responded, with disapproval to these decisions, and there was quite a bit of tension in the relationship between the OCIC and the hierarchy, which eventually was resolved. perhaps in there's a justifiable sense of we haven't focused enough on the artistry. We haven't focused enough on form. So now we're going to really focus on that. But there's the risk, of course, of tilting the ship in the other direction. And so, a lot of what the magisterium of Paul VI is saying, St. Paul VI is saying about the arts is constantly reinforcing, this is that balance. We want that balance.
Right.
Because definitely things were tilting more towards the form, really, towards a more formal kind of approach.
Yeah, and that's one of the things to this day. It's hard to find, Catholic arts scenes or organizations that are free from that tendency. Again, there's this dichotomy between like sort of the religious Philistine and the kind of loosey-goosey Catholic art scene where there aren't really standards of orthodoxy or morality in the work, and that is a frustration that I've been encountering in the Catholic art world ever since I got involved. And I see a lot of more healthy signs on the horizon now that are especially the literary world, where there's people who prize both artistic value, artistic freedom, and orthodoxy and fidelity and holiness. But it's just interesting to see that like immediately after the council, that kind of those kinds of shenanigans happening, and it sounds like I've seen awards like that being given in just the past few years and by Catholic organizations, and so it's the same thing. Another note is the question of sort of film as entertainment, and in Pius XII's apostolic exhortation on the ideal film, we see him sort of defending pure entertainment in film, given certain criteria, and that was quite interesting. But we see kind of a different emphasis here. For the most part in these documents, the emphasis is on film or art in general being more than just mere entertainment, and reaching a high cultural level. So in 1971, Communio et Progressio, it says, an unrelieved diet of productions geared to the lowest cultural level within a population which would tend to debase the taste of those who have already attained a higher level. That's interesting because you see that today where like even our cultural elite, let's put it this way, like even rich people today have really terrible vulgar taste in art, and no less than the uneducated. And so that's kind of an interesting point there, that they base the taste even of those who have already attained a higher level. And it goes on, these dangers can be avoided if communicators really care about the well-being of culture and buttress their good intentions with a sound knowledge of the science of education. So he's talking about, again, he's not just talking about art, he's talking about communication. Moreover, it will be recalled that the media are perfectly capable of productions on the highest artistic level, and these are not necessarily the most difficult to enjoy, the most difficult to follow and to enjoy for the great majority. So again, pushing against this idea that high artistic level necessarily means being, inaccessible. And that goes both ways, right? So artists should try to be accessible in some ways, right? They should not be deliberately sort of esoteric and kind of cold towards their audience. But on the other hand, there's a sense in which it's on the viewers and it's on the critics to not exaggerate the difficulty of like great works of art. Half of the battle is just like opening your mouth and like clamping it down on like the unfamiliar food, and then like within a couple bites you realize that it's enjoyable. And maybe it's not your favorite thing at first, but you grow accustomed to it. And it's like that with anything, it's like that with drinking beer even. And nobody says beer is like the most, highfalutin of drinks. So, so I think there's an obligation on both sides there to realize like, no, just because it's, high, on a high cultural level does not mean that it's inaccessible. And we have this kind of weird schism now where that seems to be the case, but that wasn't always the case.
Yeah, we're caught in this hangover kind of period of critical history in a sense where, people think people still see great art as like eating your vegetables, and it's this kind of hangover from the last century and a half of kind of, the obligation, I guess you could say, which I'm not like, there is a real obligation, I think, to seek out, what is higher. But the way that we invite people to do that, we still haven't really cracked the gentleness, I guess, the gentleness of that invite, and that it's something that everyone has a way of can find a way into, one thing that ties into this that we see in Communio and Progressio that is so profound. There's a line in section 11 where it says, communication is more than the expression of ideas and the indication of emotion. At its most profound level, it is the giving of self in love. And I'm so glad that this is here, because I mean that's a sentiment that is obviously going to be familiar to Catholic culture today. But I find it profound there because I think we do tend to default to thinking of communication as an expression of ideas.
Yeah.
At its most fundamental level, it is the giving of self. And we don't, we might affirm that theologically and how we write about it, how we talk about it in our circles, but I don't think that's quite penetrating to how we actually make films, how we make moving images. And that's really at the heart of kind of what might be undeveloped or anemic about like Catholic filmmaking culture is we haven't really processed that to truly make a film at the fullest sense, is to give self in love, whatever that means. And how that happens is particular to each film and filmmaker and the path that they find in order to do that. But that is at the heart of this. It's a kind of giving of self. It's not simply conveying information or emotion for that matter.
Right.
Just to follow up on that, there was one other aspect of that later in the document in section 72. It says, in the training of a communicator, human qualities as well as professional competence should be developed. Since the media of social communication are for mankind, communicators should be consumed by the desire to serve men. They can only achieve this if they really do know and love their fellow man. I think, someone who's going to start a podcast, I think it's very easy to read this and go, yeah, I get it. Like I'm doing this out of an evangelistic impulse. There's all sorts of, media applications obviously this is why people are starting media apostolates, but with a filmmaker, especially one who wants to make like a fiction film of some sort, that doesn't necessarily immediately correlate. But this is an area that it does correlate, but we need to flesh that out in how we talk about this in the church. Every beautiful film that's ever been made, if you really look at it and you go into what it is, I am certain that you're going to find, at the bottom, you're going to find some kind of love of fellow man that the filmmaker was animated by. And this is something that we need to really, we really need to emphasize that the making, this giving of self, this reaching out, it has profound, I guess what I'm grasping towards, it has profound formal implications for how you make something. It's not always, again, it may require a direct approach.
Also, a question of respect for man. Also, that was such a big theme in Pius XII.
Yeah, what I'm trying to get to is that there's this profound implications for how you make things that I think, there's such a freedom. Like we have such a array of potential as filmmakers to work with. We don't have to just kind of go with the same formulas. Every filmmaker,
love and do what you will.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there you go.
So I want to read one more passage on these aspirations of art in Communio et Progressio. Artistic expression, both for its own excellence and for what it does for man, should be highly appreciated. Of itself, beauty ennobles the mind that contemplates it. The work of the artist can also penetrate and illumine the deepest recesses of the human spirit. It can make spiritual reality immediate by expressing it in a way that the senses can comprehend. And as a result of this expression, man comes to know himself better. This is not only a cultural benefit, but a moral and religious one as well. It quotes Paul VI's address here. It is a fact that when you writers and artists are able to reveal in the human condition, however lowly or sad it may be, a spark of goodness, at that very instant a glow of beauty pervades your whole work. We are not asking of you that you should play the part of moralists, We are only asking you to have confidence in your mysterious power of opening up the glorious regions of light that lie behind the mystery of man's life. So I don't really want to expand on that because for the sake of time, but I thought that was worth reading.
Yep.
Also on this theme, a few quotes from John Paul II in his various World Communications Day addresses. First, the one on cinema in 1995. First of all, he talks about the cultural value of cinema. Human and religious values that deserve attention and praise are often present not only in films that make direct reference to the tradition of Christianity, but also in films of different cultures and religions. This confirms the importance of the cinema as a vehicle for cultural exchange and as an invitation to openness and reflection in dealing with the realities foreign to our upbringing and mentality. In this sense, the cinema serves to overcome distance and acquires that dignity particular to culture, which is a specific dimension of the existence and being of man. It creates among the persons within each community a complex of bonds determining the interpersonal and social character of human existence. And, I'll just say that's great coming from, you see that coming from the European standpoint too. European viewers tending to be more aware of world cinema. They're not coming from Hollywood, so at least they have some awareness of the cinema of their own countries, if not from other ones besides Hollywood. And so, I think that this is a theme on this podcast. I think American viewers, Catholic viewers, be well served by gaining a broader appreciation of cinema from other countries. But I wanna finish this quote here. He says, "To those who work in the field of cinema, I would like to extend a warm invitation not to abandon this important cultural element because it is not in accordance with the most authentic and deep demands and expectations of the human person to produce films which are devoid of content and which are aimed exclusively at entertainment or have the sole motive of increasing the size of the audience." On that point, I also want to bring up a bit from the Pontifical Council for Social Communications document from 1992, Aetatis Novae, which also deals with this film as cultural exchange theme. And in that document, there's a lot of concern about poor people, poor countries, and cultural minorities not having a voice in media and sort of being dominated by, the majority, the rich, or the, people who have access to these technologies. And it says, quote, "Commercial pressures also operate across national boundaries at the expense of particular peoples and their cultures. Faced with increasing competition and the need to develop new markets, communications firms become ever more multinational in character. At the same time, lack of local production capabilities make some countries increasingly dependent on foreign material. Thus, the products of the Sorry, I'm having trouble reading this with my camera in the way. Thus, the products of the popular media of one culture spread into another, often to the detriment of established art forms and media and the values which they embody." And so, I think that that's interesting. And it's kind of like a artistic globalism that can happen. Obviously, Western culture has, greatly enriched other cultures, and other cultures have at times greatly enriched Western culture. But in terms of sort of the power of global media, you do see problems at different times with like one country. In modern times, in recent times, Hollywood, dominating foreign film markets. There were earlier times when other European countries were dominant very, very early in cinema. But I think that obviously this is not exactly like our concern. As Americans, this is not the problem that we face of like other cultures dominating our film market, although it does other cultures dominate our market in, cars and, other things. Right. But yeah, I think it's worth mentioning as something that like we should be sensitive to in terms of our cultural dominance as Americans.
Well, I think it's worth mentioning, like, that was 30 years later, we're seeing the outcome of that. When that document was written, Chinese cinema was still recognizably working within particularly cultural, roots and sources that today, you're much more likely to find a Chinese blockbuster that is made to resemble or is made in the style of what was initially a Hollywood kind of, action or just a Hollywood populist commercial film. We're seeing that, that's coming back to our shores now. There's this concept of, it's not just China, like India is another example. I know you're a huge fan of RRR and other films that are very like populist mainstream examples. There's this, it's not just Hollywood anymore. There really is a global sort of commercial aesthetic that is meant to be absolutely maximizing entertainment value, maximizing spectacle value,
right.
In both. And it's beyond just Hollywood now. It's
and yeah, I know you love RRR too, and that of course it does inject a particular Indian approach,
yes,
right, to that model, and in a way that's still refreshing to a Western audience.
Yeah, and I would hold up examples from China and India as refreshing in that I wouldn't say that they are conquered or they're taken over by the I see it as a fresh synthesis kind of maybe what's good about the Hollywood entertainment model meeting with elements that are particular to those cultures, and what the synthesis is wonderful to behold in a way that you don't see with Hollywood productions to the same degree. So I think there's a lot of good happening there, to be clear, but at the same time we can only wonder about how that's going to shape the market, and recognizing that there is a aesthetic pressure that is appealing because it's recognized to be box office, powerful at the box office. Like, if you really, really want to reach a wide audience, this is the aesthetic framework that you should kind of work with. Like, that's only going to become more, I think, powerful and have knock-on effects in, all sorts of cultures across the world.
So that concludes the sort of the sequence of quotes on films as entertainment and this higher cultural aspiration that they should have. I also want to bring up some very interesting quotes from John Paul II's earlier World Communications Day address in 1984, and this is very I don't know, it's very John Paul II. It's like it has echoes of his his philosophical writing. Let's see. So he says, the press, cinema, the theater, radio, television, with the evolution which each of these media has undergone during the course of history, have proved to be not always adequate to the encounter between faith and culture. The culture of our time particularly seems to be dominated and shaped by the newest and most powerful among the means of communication, radio and, above all, television. So much so that at times they seem to assert themselves as ends and not as simple means, also because of the characteristics of organization and structure which they require. Nevertheless, this aspect of modern mass media must not make us forget that it is a question always of means of communication, and that this by its nature is always the communication of something. The content of the communication is therefore always determinate, and such indeed as to qualify the communication itself. We've already talked about this question of just reducing film generically to communication, but that's not what I want to focus on here. I want to talk about this this content, and we talk about the importance of form a lot on this podcast, but I think what he's talking about is not artistic form and content, but he's talking about like the communication media itself, like the technology and the delivery system becoming an end in itself. And I mean, it's a very general statement, but I wonder then if what he's getting at here might not be just the kind of like the noise and the volume of the media forms. He says radio and, above all, television. And of course, what are the things those have in common? It's that they're in your house and they never end, and you can just have them on constantly. So I don't know if that's what he's getting at, but that is a situation where it is just like the having it going, can become predominant over like whatever happens to be on, which is not something that we really saw in the previous papacies before Vatican II.
Right.
Things were just still too new. I mean, there was an awareness that film was ubiquitous and movies were forming people, but it wasn't focused on the medium per se. And it wasn't focused on, and there wasn't as much awareness of like we saw Pius XII's like optimism about television, right? And so, the dangers of just like the form were not as, in the forefront. Whereas, by the 60s and 70s and certainly by the 80s and 90s, there's a lot of conversation about this.
Yeah,
happening.
by the 80s is when you really start, I think is when you're really
Right.
starting to see this come to the fore, especially with like MTV is kind of seems to be one of the tipping points of something is different here. Something is forming us in the sort of constant background way that wasn't quite the way it was before.
Right. And there's another cool quote from here. It says, "Indeed, the mass media, whether they deal with news or concern themselves with precisely cultural topics, or whether they are used for the purpose of artistic expression and entertainment, always return to a particular concept of man, and it is precisely on the basis of the exactness and completeness of this concept that they will be judged." So I just think that's an interesting like addendum to the whole conversation of like film and being whether it can be pure entertainment or not. That whether even if it is, there's never just pure entertainment in a sense, because it always returns to a particular concept of man. And so you can't just excuse something being kind of obviously not immoral, but also just being kind of like stupid or, vulgar just on the basis of it's being, pure entertainment. That there's always something that it still has to respect man on some level, to use Pius XII's term.
Yeah. And I would take some of this from almost an opposite frame on the kind of the cultural spectrum. This, coming from like a cinephile perspective against someone who's those of us who have immersed ourselves in world cinema and slower forms of cinema, you can see an opposite tendency where you get really formed by rigorous forms of cinema that are very compelling, but they also carry a certain concept of man that is often counter to a Catholic anthropology of man. And sometimes it's hard to see that. Sometimes, even for filmmakers who are really formed by, say, like someone like Ingmar Bergman, or we could pick all sorts of examples. But Bergman is someone I think of in that he was certainly an extremely talented and powerful filmmaker, but he also struggled greatly with despair. And partly what makes his films compelling is that in some of them, at least, he is struggling with despair. But there are other examples I think we could point to where he's not necessarily struggling. It's kind of despair has won, which has a formal effect, that influences the form of how he makes his films, how the rhythm of them, the way that they kind of engage the human, the psychological experience of characters going through this kind of thing. If you're a cinephile type and you're used to that just kind of being, that's a more elevated way of like making a film because it's not like Hollywood, or it's requiring me to kind of go out of myself in order to engage with it. Sometimes when you get used to that, you actually it can be easy to miss that there is a foreign concept, foreign to Catholic faith, that is animating kind of what this film is. But because it's in a higher register, it's in a more, artistically approvable register, you kind of just let that slide. I've certainly seen this in my own life, like coming back to films that I thought were, maybe artistic masterpieces, and realizing like, actually, this is this is as damaging in its own way as like the most kind of vulgar Hollywood, like, passions film,
There are, of course, warnings against films, corrupting the youth or degrading human dignity. In a number of these documents, in Paul VI's First World Communications Day address, he particularly warns about, leading astray the efforts of the youth to give direction to their lives and confusing their aspirations with propaganda and things like that. Also in 1995, John Paul II's World Communications Day message, he says similar things about morality as he said that same year in his address to the Pontifical Council for Social Communications on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of cinema, which also produced the Vatican film list. We've already discussed that message on other episodes, which is why we're not really talking about it today. But similar to that, in his World Comms Day address, he talks about the problems when film, quote, presents itself as the mirror of negative types of behavior, using scenes of violence and sex offensive to human dignity and tending to excite violent emotions to stimulate the attention of the viewer. He says the attitude of those who irresponsibly bring about degrading imitative behavior, whose harmful effects can be read about each day in the pages of the newspapers, cannot be defined as free artistic expression. So he's clearly concerned about violence, as well as sexuality. And, it's a difficult thing as desensitized as we are with Hollywood violence, to sort of make judgments about when the church hasn't given us as precise guidelines as it has with sex. But it's something that we'll continue to try to work at this podcast, try to chip away at, and be discerning about. The last big topic I want to discuss here is the topic of education and training and communication about cinema. As I said earlier, that's an increasing theme in these documents. So I just want to read a few. We're running out of time here, but I want to read a few quotes, and we can make what comments we deem appropriate. But so I'll start with 1995, John Paul II's World Communications Day address. He says, in order to be sure that the messages that the cinema might offer for the human and spiritual growth of those who use it are fully understood, it is also important to take care of the education of viewers in the language of film, which often departs from the direct representation of reality in order to use systems of symbols not always easy to comprehend. It is very useful when, even in school, teachers devote attention to this problem, sensitizing the students to images and gradually developing their critical attitude towards an idiom that is by now an integral part of our culture. And it's just interesting. I never really experienced that in school. Of course, we had discussions of literature, which might contribute somewhat to that ability to interpret images.
This is in a Catholic school.
Yeah, in my Catholic high school, a good school. And we also had a logic class and, discussion of fallacies, which of course included, some discussions of marketing and advertising and the fallacies that might be used to convince you to buy a product and things like that. But we didn't really do that with film in particular. There's only so much time you can take in school, but it just makes me think that there's a distinction between like the thing that classical schools want to avoid, which is just teaching pop culture, like teaching a class on Harry Potter, spending all your time watching movies in class and stuff like that. That's obviously to be avoided, but there's got to be some way to incorporate this and some way to, prepare students and again, maybe teaching the classics of literature and the classics of art is a good enough way to do that, to sort of inoculate people to some degree against sort of TV and film and press propaganda. So maybe it doesn't need to be addressed like head on in all schools in that particular way. But, I think it's still something worth considering as at least like spending some time talking about like the way, not just like moral and immoral content per se, but like the way that certain things can be presented in a way that is seductive or deceptive or cheap or vulgar, or whatever.
Yeah, I just want to chime in. I think there's a way there's a real gap there again in understanding that at the formal level, where I think the two battles that any young person has to go through to start appreciating cinema, like real cinema, is you have to go through the experience of realizing that film can handle the deepest things of life. You watch a film that akin to a great novel reveals to you that this can wrestle with the most important questions, which opens up a very literary element of engaging with it. But then there's a second stage that I think we have to go through, a lot of people just stay at that stage. They stay and they realize, hey, films can be great can be great works of literature in a sense, and that's where they stay. Right. Whereas there's a second move that has to be made, which is you have to understand the way that the film acts on you formally changes your sense of consciousness, such that you have to actually go out to meet it. You have to be willing to be okay with not feeling okay necessarily about the pacing of something, or at least be curious about why is it that way. Create that kind of critical investigation where you're going out to meet the work, and once you understand what it's doing, every door unlocks. Then you can watch anything. Obviously, that's not morally objectionable. But those are the two stages that I think certainly every cinephile, anyone who comes to love cinema at the deepest level, that's what you go through. If there was a way that we could educate students, as a matter of just normal Catholic education in that way, I think we would see some pretty powerful effects. Because just one last point, especially with regards to like rhythm and editing. What do we see in social media today, like TikTok culture, the way that these TikToks videos are, and other short forms of video are edited, they're getting more and more jagged. They're getting more and more abrasive. They're changing, and we're adapting. Like, this is how we're starting to see reality. Someone who's really immersed in the freedom that a filmmaker has to change, to affect the rhythm of something and to invite you into the beauty of that rhythm, there's a kind of inoculation. You're not necessarily going to be swept up by the latest trend in media rhythms that is constantly forcing you to not contemplate.
Yeah. Anyway, Communio et Progressio also says this quote: "This sort of training must be given a regular place in school curricula for similar reasons." But another thing from John Paul II on this topic, he talks about doing this at home. Parents have to, educate their children in accurate reading and understanding of films that enter their home each day. And he says, quote, "In the context of the necessary education of viewers, the social component of the cinema must not be forgotten. This could offer suitable opportunities for dialogue among those that use the medium through an exchange of opinions on the issue in question. It is also very useful, especially for young people, to organize film circles where, with the guidance of qualified persons, they may learn to express themselves and to listen to others in a constructive and serene exchange of opinions." And this is exactly what this podcast is kind of trying to simulate when we do our film discussions. That's exactly the approach we wanted to take.
Everybody out there, start a film small group. Have your friends over. Yeah. Just start doing it.
Yep, it's a great idea. So just a little bit more on this topic, now moving back to 1971, Communio and Progressio. And it's talking about this same idea of media training for young people. It says, "Generosity and idealism are admirable qualities in young people. So are their frankness and sincerity. But these qualities, along with self-discipline, will only survive if they are guarded and fostered from an early age. This is why parents and teachers should urge children to make their own choices, even if the educators should reserve at times the final decision to themselves. And if they find themselves forced to disapprove of the way their children are using some aspect of the media, they must clearly explain the reasons for their objections. Persuasion works better than prohibition, and this is especially true in education. Adults should realize that the psychology of children differs from that of adults. Because of this, programs that seem meaningless to them may be useful to children and even to teenagers." So, obviously, maybe take that optimism about like children sort of making their own decisions with a grain of salt. But, I think if you're talking about developing taste, I think there's some value to that. Obviously, parents should be educating their children in good taste in art and stuff like that. But the idea that, rather than just like, this stinks, and so you're not allowed to, watch it, even if there's like no moral problem, that there should be like a real discussion and kind of like illumination so that the child won't just sort of like gorge themselves on it when they, gain full autonomy. And before we go, as we ended our previous episode with Pius XII, I also want to end with this quote on critics from Communio et Progressio. And this is like the most detailed discussion that we've seen of the role of the critic. So, of course, again, this is not just about art. This is about communication in general, critics of social communication. Okay, so the document says, critics have a commanding role in getting communicators to maintain the highest standards of integrity and service and continually to make progress. As they themselves are also communicators, they provide the self-criticism within the profession, and in this way they are able to protect creative artists from external pressures. I'm a little bit skeptical of whether a film critic can be like, I'm within the profession, so this is self-criticism, because obviously, I'm having occupied both roles with music, and criticism, I think critics often don't know what they're talking about, or they at least take liberties that they shouldn't in terms of telling artists what to do as though they had experienced the process of making art. But anyway, to go on, he says, they must be convinced that integrity and incorruptibility are the essence of their profession. They will be inspired by fidelity to truth and a passion for justice. In a cool and objective way, they should try to display both the strength and the weakness of the work under review so that the public can make its own fair judgment. The importance of their own creative art should not be underrated, especially when through their wide knowledge and their penetrating judgment, they are able to discover in works of art meaning and riches that may have escaped even the artists themselves. Yet they should not attract all attention to themselves at the expense of the work under study. The last little bit there is my favorite, that there is an art, of criticism.
Yes.
And I think that when this is working at its best, I think that artists and critics, artists have been able to recognize, oh, you saw something that I didn't even intend there, but that's a good insight. So hopefully at its best, things can work in that way. Yeah. So that's Vatican II and beyond. That's the final episode. Any closing thoughts, Nathan?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think I just really enjoy, from going into these documents, I really see, what I was sort of saying at the beginning about film is getting kind of lost. Film as an art is getting lost in this wider concept of social communication. By the 90s, by 1995, you really see it reemerging as a specific concern and really being recognized again as a specific art. And I would just throw this out there to, other filmmakers and critics and people who are interested in promoting a Catholic culture of cinema. What comes after the 95 World Comms Day address? Well, a few years later, we have the letter to artists, and we have this, return to really looking at the meaning of art as good, true, and beautiful. And obviously that's permeated much of English-speaking Catholic culture in the last 25 years. So I would just pose this, kind of as a challenge to myself and to other artists, other film artists, what's next? I think we see this progression of the church is really wrestling with film all through these decades and really trying to put, her hand on what it is. And that story isn't over. We're still working on that. And I think we're in a pretty exciting time of really trying to figure out that question. Something is definitely stirring amongst a lot of people interested in this topic. So for those of you out there, it's keep going at what you're doing. And I'm really excited to see kind of what comes next as we really begin to look at cinema in the context of the philosophy of beauty that the church is always returning to and always coming back to with fresh insights.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, Nathan, for joining me on this mini series. I appreciate all of the research and time that you've put into it.
Thanks, Thomas. It was a real pleasure, and yeah, I hope everybody who's stuck with us this long, I thank you for sticking with us through this, and I hope you enjoyed it, and you will go do something with whatever you learned.
All right, everybody. See you next time.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.